Thom Hartmann here with you, feeling considerably better. I had this thing going on in my lungs for a couple of days, but I think I'm kicking it, which is nothing like time-release vitamin C and guaifenesin, right? In any case, today is April 20th. April 20th is 420. 420 is like hot. So I'm not going to do anything on the air. No, I'm serious. I'm not. Even though it's legal here in Washington, D.C. But it's interesting. CBS News just came out today with a new report based on a survey that CBS had funded, a CBS News poll. And, excuse me, 61% of Americans think marijuana use should be legal. That's a 5-point increase from last year. 88% favor medical marijuana use. 71% oppose the federal government's efforts to stop marijuana sales in the states that have legalized it. And that includes majority opposition from Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So this is clearly the will of the country, is to have legal recreational and medicinal pot. 65% think marijuana is less dangerous than other drugs. I mean, that's pretty amazing. In fact, most Americans view marijuana, in particular, as safer than alcohol, quoting from the article by Jennifer DePinto, Fred Backus, Kabir Khanna, and Anthony Salvanto. So on this 420, this is you know, there's a lot of things that when I started the show, 14 years ago, roughly, 2003, I never would have predicted, you know, that the majority of Americans would want decriminalized recreational pot, and a bunch of states would have done it, that gay marriage would be legal and, you know, broadly, widely accepted, that an orange, strange person would be in the White House. I mean, it's just, there's just a lot that I never would have predicted. Anyhow, 420, West Virginia also just signed a medical marijuana law, although being a, shall we say, Republican-dominated state, the law really severely limits the medical conditions for which this can be prescribed. Cancer, AIDS, ALS, Parkinson's, MS, spinal cord damage, epilepsy, neuropathies, Huntington's disease, Crohn's disease, PTSD, intractable seizures, sickle cell anemia, and intractable pain, where opiate therapy is contraindicated. So it's going to be very difficult to get it, and the law doesn't go into effect until July 1st of 2019, roughly over 2 years from now, 2 years and a month in West Virginia. So, you know, incremental change, step by step. Meanwhile, over at the BBC, there's a fascinating article at bbc.com titled How Western Civilization Could Collapse by Rachel Newer. And the subhead says, some possible precipitating factors are already in place. How the West reacts to them will determine the world's future. She uses the metaphor, and she actually, it was political economist Benjamin Friedman, and so she's quoting him, that basically Western societies are like a bicycle. You know, if you're on the bicycle and the wheels are moving, then you are vertical, your feet are not on the ground, and you are moving forward, and all is good. But what happens if the wheels stop moving? The bicycle falls over. And there's no easy way to get it back up and running again without a major insertion of an external force, of external energy. Now, this is very much what happened in the era of 1929 to 1935. When, you know, the Republican Great Depression of 1929, Herbert Hoover administration, caused the bicycle to fall over. And we just kind of floundered on the ground for 3 years until FDR came in and said, okay, you know, we're going to take a massive injection of money and effort from the federal government and get this bicycle back up and get it rolling. In this BBC article, she points out such collapses have occurred many times in human history, and she goes through examples of where, and, you know, examples around the country, around the world, and things like that. Another sign, she writes, that we're entering into a danger zone is the increasing occurrences of nonlinearities, or sudden, unexpected changes in the world's order. She gives the example of Syria. So there's a bunch of things, and goes back to ancient Rome and things like that. So yeah, maybe we should be concerned about this stuff. So that then leads me to an article that was in yesterday's Financial Times. In fact, it was the top of the fold. It was the very top story for most of the morning yesterday in the Financial Times, and I was gonna get into it, but the day kind of got away from me. So I share it with you now, but it's still there on FT.com. And the headline sort of says it all. IMF says debt binge leaves U.S. corporate assets exposed. Global Financial Stability Report warns of risks from U.S. business loans. The article written by Sean Donnan and Gemma Tetlow in Washington, a debt binge has left a quarter of U.S. corporate assets, a quarter, that's 25%, a quarter of U.S. assets vulnerable to a sudden increase in interest rates, with the ability of companies to cover interest payments at its weakest since the 2008 financial crisis by one measurement, the International Monetary Fund has warned. This is the IMF's, twice a year they issue what they call the Global Financial Stability Report. They released theirs yesterday, the one for, the first half of 2017. And they point out in this report that Trump says that he wants to boost U.S. spending and he wants to do tax cuts. And as they write in the article, the IMF's assumption is that tax cuts will end up adding to both the U.S. deficit and the country's debt load, predicting that it could be as much as 11 percentage points of gross domestic product larger in 5 years than the forecast a year ago. And they talk the impact of this on the borrowing cost for U.S. companies is going to be huge. And by the way, they say, which according to the IMF, these U.S. companies have added $7.8 trillion in debt and other liabilities just since 2010. Keep in mind, the GDP of the entire United States is $15 trillion a year. And U.S. companies have added $7.8 trillion in debt just since 2010. The problem, they write in the Financial Times, according to fund economists, is that already, and now quoting from the IMF, corporate credit fundamentals in the United States have started to weaken, creating conditions that have historically preceded a credit cycle downturn. End of quote from the IMF. Back to the article from the Financial Times. And by the IMF's calculations, companies with almost $4 trillion in assets, 22% of total U.S. corporate assets, would be weak or vulnerable. So, a great time to go, whoa. And then later on in the article, they get into, some of the various companies and what they're doing and how they're doing it, and all these kind of things. Meanwhile, speaking of debt, Betsy DeVos, our billionaire Treasury or Education Secretary, big sister to Eric Prince, who's apparently doing some very interesting and funky consulting with the Trump administration and perhaps with Russia, who knows. But Education Secretary Betsy DeVos is inexplicably backing away from rules that are meant to prevent federal student loan borrowers from being fleeced by companies the government pays to collect the loans and to guide people through the repayment process. You get this? This is an editorial. This is by the editorial board. It means the conservatives at the New York Times editorial board, the liberals at the New York Times editorial board, the professional journalists at the New York, they all agreed on this. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos is inexplicably backing away from rules that are meant to prevent federal student loan borrowers from being fleeced by companies the government pays, you and I pay with our tax dollars, to collect loans and guide people through the repayment process. On Tuesday, she withdrew a sound Obama administration policy that required the Education Department to take into account the past conduct of loan servicing companies before awarding them lucrative contracts, and to include consumer protection in those contracts as well. In other words, now we'll just hand these contracts out to companies, no matter how terribly they've treated people, no matter what they've been up to. The suit brought by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau claims that Navient, for example, they're facing several lawsuits for putting their own interests before the interests of the borrower. Well, gee, what a surprise. A for-profit corporation wants to rip people off. The government stopped it. Betsy DeVos comes in and says, oh, no, we're not going to stop that anymore. You kidding? We're the Trump administration. We're Republicans.